My name is Jillian Mercer, and I was 34 years old the night my mother called to tell me I could come to dinner, as long as I understood one thing before I walked in. I was to stay quiet. Not polite, not warm, not careful, quiet. She said it the way people talk when they've already decided what role you're allowed to play, and all that's left is making sure you don't forget it. The dinner was supposed to be important. My younger brother was bringing the two families together in a more formal way, and her focus wasn't on whether I wanted to be there, whether I belonged there, or whether anyone had stopped to consider that I might be tired of being treated like an inconvenience in my own family. Her focus was on keeping the evening smooth, controlled, and impressive, because his girlfriend's father was a federal judge. That was the part she kept circling back to, as if those 4 words explained everything. As if they justified the late-night call, the strain in her voice, and the warning hidden inside what was supposed to sound like an invitation. She never said she was ashamed of me. She didn't have to. Families like mine rarely use the ugliest words out loud. They prefer cleaner ones, softer ones. Words like timing, atmosphere, first impressions. Let's not make tonight about you. I understood exactly what she meant. By then, I had years of practice translating my family's language into the truth underneath it. I knew what it meant when my accomplishments made a room go cold instead of proud. I knew what it meant when my brother's milestones were celebrated like victories for all of us, while mine were treated like private details no one needed to ask about. I knew what it meant to be called difficult when all I had really done was stop making it easy for people to reduce me. So I said very little, let her finish, and hung up with the kind of calm that only comes after disappointment has become familiar. What she didn't understand was that asking me to stay quiet wasn't the same thing as keeping me small. And whatever she thought that dinner was going to prove about our family, it did the opposite. Before the night was over, the only person at that table who seemed to know exactly who I was turned out to be the one man my mother was trying hardest to impress. And once that happened, there was no saving the evening, no smoothing it over, and no going back to the version of me they had been handing to people for years. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. By morning, the pattern felt familiar. My brother, Ethan Mercer, had spent most of his life standing in the warm center of our family, while I learned how to live at the edges of it. He was 2 years younger than I was, but that never mattered inside our house. What mattered was that people liked him quickly. He was easy to celebrate, easy to excuse, easy to build a family narrative around. Ethan had a way of moving through the world without ever having to wonder whether he belonged in it, and our parents made sure that confidence had a home to grow in. My mother, Denise Mercer, loved anything she could turn into a story other people would admire. My father, Paul Mercer, preferred silence to conflict, which in practice meant he spent years making room for her version of reality. Together, they built a family structure that looked ordinary from the outside and felt uneven in ways that were hard to describe unless you had lived inside it. Ethan's successes were communal. His mistakes were temporary. His moods were understandable. My achievements, on the other hand, were treated like private technicalities, useful only if they reflected well on someone else. I understood that difference early. When Ethan did well in school, dinner became a celebration. When I did well, my mother would nod and move on to something lighter, as if too much attention on me might interrupt the atmosphere she preferred. If Ethan changed majors, that meant he was finding himself. If I made a demanding choice, that meant I was intense. If he needed help, resources appeared. If I succeeded alone, that somehow became proof that I did not need anything from anyone and therefore should not expect much. Families don't need dramatic betrayals to teach a child where she stands. Sometimes repetition does the job more efficiently than cruelty ever could. By the time I entered the legal world, that pattern had hardened. I was drawn to difficult work, the kind that demanded discipline, precision, and the ability to stay steady in rooms where pressure did half the talking. I did not choose that path for prestige. I chose it because the law rewarded clarity, and clarity had always felt cleaner than emotion in my family. It also gave me something no one at home ever really offered: standards that did not move depending on who was being judged. My parents never fully understood what I did, and after a while, I stopped trying to translate it for them. To them, my career existed as a collection of vaguely impressive words with no emotional meaning attached. They did not ask the right questions, not because the answers were complicated, but because curiosity was never the point. They knew I worked long hours. They knew my cases were serious. They knew enough to mention the field when it was socially useful. Beyond that, my life seemed to them like a distant weather system, real, but happening somewhere else. Ethan, meanwhile, became the sun around whom everything still organized itself. When he met the woman he was planning a future with, the tone in my mother's voice changed almost overnight. She heard the father's title before she heard anything else. After that, every conversation about the relationship carried a new note beneath it, something sharper than excitement and more revealing than pride. She was not just happy for him. She was alert, strategic. The possibility of proximity to status had entered the room, and once it did, she started treating the entire relationship like an audition the rest of us had better not ruin. That was when I noticed the shift become more deliberate. My schedule suddenly mattered only when it conflicted with family optics. My presence became something to manage. Invitations came late. Details came selectively, and any hesitation on my part was quietly recast as distance or attitude. No one said I was being edged out. They did not need to. Exclusion is often most effective when it arrives disguised as logistics, oversight, or concern about whether a certain setting will be comfortable for you. By the time that dinner was arranged in Washington, I already knew my role in it had been decided without me. What mattered to them was never the whole truth of who I was. It was whether I could be fitted into the version of the family they wanted displayed under good lighting, at the right table, in front of the right people, without asking anyone to look too closely. Soon after that, everything around Ethan's relationship began to acquire a polish that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with presentation. Once my mother understood exactly who Audrey's father was, she treated the relationship less like a private commitment between two adults and more like the arrival of a panel of judges she had been preparing for all her life. Audrey Holloway herself was pleasant, composed, and better-mannered than most people I had grown up around. She did not move through a room like someone trying to dominate it. If anything, she seemed used to being watched and had learned early how to make that feel effortless. That, more than anything, made my mother even more determined to impress her. It was not enough that Ethan was happy. Happiness was never a complete story in our house unless it could be arranged into something flattering from the outside. My mother began speaking about dinners, holidays, and future plans with an alertness that felt less maternal than tactical. My father followed her lead the way he always did, offering small practical comments, pretending practicality was neutrality, and letting her decide what version of the family would be presented. Ethan seemed to enjoy the extra attention without thinking too hard about what it cost anyone else. He had spent his whole life being rewarded for accepting comfort as his natural setting, so it never appeared to occur to him that someone else was being pushed farther out each time he was pulled closer to the center. I was not openly excluded. The process was subtler than that, which made it harder to challenge without sounding petty. Information reached me late. Plans were mentioned after they had already taken shape. If I was available, my presence was treated as optional. If I hesitated, that hesitation was quietly used as proof that I preferred distance anyway. My mother was particularly skilled at that kind of revision. She could make a choice that diminished you and then describe the result as if you had authored it yourself. Over time, I noticed that Audrey knew almost nothing specific about me. That was not her fault. It was simply what happened when one family member was consistently translated through someone else's discomfort. She knew I lived in Washington. She knew I worked in law. Beyond that, I seemed to exist in the vague category of relatives who are technically impressive but somehow inconvenient in practice. I could feel the shape of the story that had been given to her without ever hearing it directly. I was the older sister who was serious, private, difficult to place, not especially close to the family, probably happier keeping to herself. None of those details were outright lies, which was what made them useful. Distortion rarely begins with invention. It begins by selecting only the pieces that keep other people from asking better questions. As Audrey and Ethan became more serious, my mother's need for control intensified. She started caring about seating arrangements before there were seats, about photographs before there were events, about tone before there was even a conversation worth having. She asked strange, loaded questions that were never really questions at all. Would I be comfortable there? Would it be easier if things stayed small? Did I think some settings were more Ethan's world than mine? The wording shifted, but the message underneath it never did. She wanted me manageable, ideally quiet, preferably grateful for whatever narrow space I was offered. Then the dinner in Washington was arranged at an Italian restaurant inside one of those old hotels built to make power look graceful rather than obvious. It was described as intimate, which usually means every detail matters more. Not an engagement party, not a formal announcement, just a dinner between families before the next stage of everything became public. That distinction mattered to my mother because intimacy, in her mind, did not reduce pressure. It concentrated it. She spoke about the evening like a woman rehearsing entry into a world she believed had better standards than her own, and for days I had the unmistakable sense that my role in the night was being negotiated in rooms I was not standing in. By the time she finally called me, long after any ordinary courtesy would have made sense, I already knew I was not being invited into the evening as myself. I was being fitted into it like an unstable object someone hoped would stay exactly where it had been placed. I arrived a few minutes early, which gave me just enough time to see the evening clearly before anyone had the chance to explain it to me. The hotel had the kind of old Washington elegance that made power look inherited instead of performed. The restaurant itself was warm without being soft, polished without appearing modern, the sort of place where every chair seemed chosen to remind people that money and taste were not always the same thing, though they often liked to be mistaken for each other. I remember thinking that my mother had picked exactly the kind of room where she could mistake atmosphere for validation. I was dressed the way I always dressed for serious spaces, understated, fitted, impossible to criticize without sounding ridiculous. I had no interest in proving anything with my appearance. I simply refused to walk into another family event looking as if I had accepted the part they kept trying to hand me. My mother saw me first. Her eyes moved over me in one fast, private sweep that told me she was checking for problems, not greeting her daughter. She approved of what she saw, which meant I had passed one more silent test I had never agreed to take. My father gave me the restrained half-smile he relied on when he wanted credit for warmth without having to spend much energy producing it. Ethan was standing close to Audrey, relaxed in the way people get when they believe the room has already arranged itself in their favor. Audrey looked elegant and self-possessed, but there was a trace of curiosity in the way she took me in, as if she had expected me to be easier to categorize on sight. Her mother noticed me with the careful attentiveness of someone who had spent years watching other people before deciding what they were really saying. Her father was turned away at first, speaking to Ethan near the end of the table, and I was absurdly conscious of that fact even though I had no reason to be. My mother moved quickly to establish the tone. Introductions were efficient. Details were selective. I was not misrepresented outright. She was too practiced for that. Instead, she handled me the way people handle information they consider risky, by thinning it out until it could no longer alter the atmosphere. My name, my city, my work in law, and then the conversation was guided elsewhere before the shape of any real question could form. I had seen that maneuver before. It was one of her favorites. Leave just enough truth on the table to appear honest, then remove the parts that might complicate the story. The seating arrangement did the rest. No one announced it, but placement is its own language at family gatherings, especially formal ones. Ethan and Audrey were positioned where the eye naturally rested. Their parents framed the table the way adults do when they are both blessing and observing a future. I was placed farther down, not isolated enough to make the decision obvious, just distant enough to reduce the odds of spontaneous engagement. It was the kind of choice people can always defend later. That seat was open. Someone had to sit there. You're imagining something personal. But I knew better. My family had always excelled at arranging things so that the injury stayed deniable. Dinner moved forward in that careful social rhythm designed to keep everyone lightly impressed. There was talk of the city, of travel, of work schedules, of the inconvenience of public visibility, of neighborhoods changing too quickly and institutions changing too slowly. My mother contributed more than usual, which was never a good sign. She was performing steadiness, which meant she felt threatened by something she could not name aloud. Ethan was animated without seeming strained. Audrey balanced him well, adding substance where he relied on charm. Her mother listened more than she spoke, and that alone made her the most interesting person at the table after me. I could tell she was noticing the same things I was, though perhaps not yet with the same vocabulary. More than once, conversation moved near me and then bent away before settling. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to comment on it, just often enough to make the structure visible if you were the person it was built around. I did what I had learned to do years earlier. I stayed composed. I paid attention. I said only what was necessary, and nothing that could be turned against me later as evidence of tension, ambition, distance, or attitude. But restraint can create its own gravity. After a while, people begin to notice the person who is not competing to be noticed. And somewhere between the second course and dessert, before the evening had fully decided what it wanted to become, I felt the first shift in the room that did not come from my mother at all. He turned toward me so casually that for a second I thought I had imagined the change in his attention. Until then, the evening had followed the pattern my mother seemed to want: smooth on the surface, carefully curated, full of the kind of conversation that allows people to feel close without risking anything honest. Then Audrey's father looked directly at me, and the air at the table altered in a way no one else could control. He paused, studied my face with the narrowed concentration of someone pulling a detail out of professional memory, and set his glass down without taking his eyes off me. I had seen that expression before in courtrooms and conference rooms, in the brief stillness before a person says something precise enough to rearrange an entire conversation. When he spoke, his tone was measured and courteous. He asked whether we had appeared before each other in federal court. That was all. No raised voice, no performance, just one clean question in a room that had been depending on vagueness. I answered briefly. Yes, we had. I reminded him of the matter, the district, the hearing. Recognition settled over his face after that. He remembered me. Not vaguely, not politely. He remembered exactly where he had seen me and in what capacity. In less than a minute, he undid years of reduction. He addressed me with the respect my profession required, not the watered-down version of me that had been offered to the table earlier in the night. He mentioned the office I worked for, the seriousness of the work, and the fact that he remembered my preparation and the clarity of my arguments. He was not praising me to be kind. He was stating professional facts as if there were no reason anyone in the room would be surprised by them. That was the moment the evening split in two. Before that question, my mother still believed she was managing the architecture of the night. After it, the structure belonged to reality. I did not need to look at her to know what had happened to her face. I could feel the collapse of control in the sudden stillness around me. My father's silence changed texture. Ethan stopped moving in the loose, easy way he had all evening. Audrey's expression sharpened. Her mother gave me a look I recognized. Not pity, not curiosity, but recalculation. Judge Holloway continued speaking to me the way one professional speaks to another when a social setting intersects with real work. He asked how long I had been with the U.S. Attorney's Office. He referenced another matter in passing, one I had not realized he would remember. Even that small exchange landed with more force than any dramatic speech possibly could have. It established the one thing my mother had spent years trying to blur whenever I was around people whose opinions she valued. I was not difficult to place. I occupied a clear position in a world governed by standards she did not control. I kept my answers short because I was not there to impress anyone. I was answering direct questions from a man whose only mistake that evening had been assuming my family knew how to describe me honestly. The problem with truth, once it enters a room like that, is that it makes every earlier choice visible. My mother's thin introduction, the seat at the far end, the way conversation had moved past me and away again. The strategic vagueness around my work. All of it looked different now because the right person had named the thing everyone else had left blurry. Ethan was the first to speak after that, and even then it was less a statement than an involuntary attempt to bridge a gap that had opened too fast for him to understand. He asked how the two of us knew each other with the uneasy tone of someone discovering that the official version of his own family had been missing entire sections. Judge Holloway answered before I could. He said he knew me from federal litigation in Washington and spoke as though this were ordinary information, the kind of thing a brother would obviously know. That assumption alone landed harder than anything else. Audrey turned toward Ethan then, and I saw the first real separation between them that evening. She was not looking at me as if I had changed. She was looking at him as if he might not understand his own life as well as he had believed. Across from her, my mother tried to recover the tone of the evening, but the room had already moved beyond her reach. Once a federal judge recognizes you across a dinner table and addresses you with unmistakable professional respect, there is no graceful way for the family that tried to reduce you to start pretending they simply forgot to mention a few details. Nothing loud happened after that, which was why the damage went so deep. No one knocked over a glass. No one stormed out. What happened instead was quieter and far more difficult to repair. The moment Judge Holloway placed me accurately inside my life, every omission around me became impossible not to notice. Conversation did not stop, but it lost its script. The table was still elegant, the service discreet, the lighting flattering, and none of it mattered anymore. My mother tried to regain control with the only tools that had ever worked for her: tone, pacing, and the suggestion that nothing unusual had taken place. But there is a limit to what atmosphere can do once facts have entered the room. Audrey's mother was the first to test the new reality. She asked how long I had been in my current role. There was nothing aggressive in it, just direct interest. I answered plainly. I had been in Washington for years. Audrey listened more closely after that. So did Ethan. And, because neither of them could hide inside professional shorthand, the shape of the problem emerged in the most ordinary way possible. They realized they did not know basic things about me that they should have known if my place in the family had ever been treated as worth understanding. Ethan asked when I had started working with the U.S. Attorney's Office. The question itself was harmless. The timing of it was not. It hung in the air as a quiet confession that he was hearing details about his sister from another man at a dinner meant to honor his future. I told him. Then Audrey asked whether I had always been in Washington or whether I had moved for the work. I answered that too. Each response was short. I had no desire to turn the table into a correction of the last 10 years. The facts were doing enough on their own. My mother attempted to smooth things over by saying that I had always been independent, as if independence explained why her own son seemed surprised to discover the outline of my career. That was the kind of sentence that used to work in our family because no one ever pushed on it. Judge Holloway did not push either, but he looked at her with the stillness of a man who had spent decades hearing incomplete stories. Audrey's mother asked whether my work kept me busy enough that family gatherings were difficult. It was a generous question. It gave my mother an opening to blame distance on scheduling. I could have let her take it. Then I realized how tired I was of helping other people preserve a version of events built out of convenience. So I answered carefully and without heat. I said the work was demanding, yes, but that was not really the reason I had become less visible at family events over time. I said it was easier to stay away from spaces where I was treated like a complication that needed to be managed. No one interrupted me. Ethan looked at me with the stunned expression of someone hearing a sentence that should not be new to him, and yet somehow was. My father lowered his eyes to the tablecloth in the way he did whenever truth began to sound like accountability. My mother's face changed in small, controlled increments. She was still trying to preserve dignity, but now dignity and control were no longer the same thing. She said I was making the evening heavier than it needed to be. The evening had been heavy before I arrived. I had simply stopped carrying all of it by myself. I did not raise my voice. I did not list old injuries. I said only what could not honestly be denied. My family had never had trouble speaking about me when I was useful as a contrast or a warning. What they had trouble with was speaking about me accurately in rooms where accuracy mattered. Ethan tried to step in then, but his confusion made him clumsy. He said he had thought I preferred privacy. That landed exactly where it needed to. Prefer? As if withdrawal had been a taste rather than an adaptation. I looked at him and understood that being favored had made him incurious. Audrey noticed. So did her parents. None of them overreacted. That was what made the shift irreversible. They did not need a dramatic confrontation to understand the family dynamic they were sitting inside. They only needed to see that the woman my mother had been treating as a social risk was the most professionally grounded person at the table and the least protected inside her family. By dessert, the dinner was intact. Plates were cleared. Water was poured. Courtesy remained. But whatever blessing my mother thought the night might place over my brother's future had already failed. After that, things became simpler in the way painful truths sometimes do. Not easier, not softer, just clearer. My mother called the next morning before most people in Washington had finished their first cup of coffee. I let the phone ring until it stopped. Then she texted. Then my father tried. Then Ethan. I did not answer any of them that day. For the first time, I was not interested in managing the emotional mess other people made out of their choices. My mother would not want to talk about what had happened to me. She would want to talk about what had happened to the evening. That had always been the trick in my family. Harm was never measured by what they did. It was measured by how inconvenient it became once anyone else could see it. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming, and their pattern told me everything I needed to know. My father wanted peace. Ethan wanted explanation. My mother wanted revision. Not one of them began where they should have begun. No one said we failed you for years and we were wrong. They wanted access without accountability, conversation without honesty, repair without recognition. I had spent too much of my life accepting those terms. Ethan eventually left me a message long enough to reveal more than he intended. He said he had not known things were that bad. He said Audrey had been distant since the dinner. He said her parents were reconsidering how quickly both families should move forward. He sounded shaken, but even then the center of his distress was still himself. He was only beginning to understand that being loved carelessly can make a person morally lazy. I listened once, deleted the message, and felt no impulse to comfort him. Audrey did not contact me directly, but I did not need her to. I understood what that silence meant. Her family had seen enough. Whatever future had seemed easy under soft lighting in that dining room now came with questions my brother was not prepared to answer. Not because he had lied in some dramatic way, but because he had moved through his own life without looking closely at the machinery that benefited him. A lie can be corrected. Character is slower. My mother sent the message that settled everything 3 nights later. She said families should not let one awkward evening become permanent damage. Awkward. That word told me all I needed to know. What happened at that table was not awkward. It was revelation. Once I understood that she would protect her pride more fiercely than she had ever protected me, the decision stopped feeling dramatic. It became administrative. I blocked her number first, then my father's, then Ethan's. I muted emails, redirected messages, declined invitations before they could fully arrive. I did not announce some grand separation. I simply ended my participation in a system that had required my silence in order to function. In the months that followed, my life became quieter in the healthiest possible way. Work remained demanding, but it was clean. Friendship felt steadier. My apartment felt like mine in a way it never had before. I slept better. I thought more clearly. I noticed how much energy I had once spent anticipating disappointment and calling it loyalty. I stopped rehearsing imaginary conversations in my head. I stopped bracing for guilt disguised as concern. The absence of all that noise gave my mind back to me. I heard through other people that my brother's relationship survived for a while, and then collapsed under the weight of things that had probably been fragile long before that dinner. I was not surprised. When respect has to be performed for strangers before it can be offered at home, something fundamental is already broken. I did not celebrate any of it. I was never trying to ruin anyone. I was simply no longer willing to disappear so other people could keep pretending they were decent. And with distance, I began to understand something else that took me years to name. The loneliest part of being underestimated is not that people failed to see your value. It is that they often expect you to help them continue misunderstanding you because your silence keeps their version of the family intact. If there is any value in my story, it is this. Being related to someone does not give them unlimited access to your dignity. Family can fail you quietly for years and still expect gratitude because the failures were dressed as normal life. But neglect repeated often enough becomes its own truth, and one day you are allowed to stop translating it into love. That was the lesson I carried away from that dinner. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is leave without creating one more argument for people to determine not to understand you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it stayed with you, I hope it reminds you that peace is not the same thing as silence, that boundaries are not cruelty, and that walking away can be the first respectful thing you finally do for yourself. Our team is working hard to create meaningful, engaging stories that leave a lasting impression on viewers. We are committed to making it clear that these are fictional stories created to share educational lessons, positive values, and useful life insights with our audience. The antagonists in this story may have believed control, pride, and manipulation would always protect them, but in the end their choices only expose their true character. What about you? If you were in this story, how would you deal with a person like that? And what would your response be?